why do animals and children play? Why do they play? I mean, you could argue that it's maladaptive. It could get you into trouble. You're making noise, attracting predators. For almost 100 years there, about 100 years, it was forgotten. It was publishing company didn't see fit to republish it. Nobody seemed interested in it. No technique for improving IQ scores has been discovered beyond fast action video games.
Why do we play? More than that, why do we play more than any other animal and for longer, well into adulthood? In 2006, Raph Koster, who's been on the podcast before, released A Theory of Fun, which aimed to put an evolutionary psychology lens over this question, and the theory was fun is learning. But back then it felt more like a theory. After 20 years of new science pointing at the connections between fun and learning, it's starting to feel more like fact. So I sought out Peter Gray, research professor of psychology and neuroscience at Boston College. He's the author of the incredibly well-researched Free to Learn, as well as his Substack, Play Makes Us Human. Peter has spent decades on the question of why we play, as well as how a playful state of mind is kind of a learning superpower. He joins grokludo now to talk about our evolutionary drive to play, as well as how these ideas were kind of forgotten for the better part of a century, and how we can use this info to design our lives. Enjoy. Within the gaming space, we've been talking about this theory for quite a while, where fun is linked to learning, and fun is almost synonymous to learning. And there was even a book called A Theory of Fun. The author Raph Koster, we've had on the podcast before, and he was talking about how some of the things that he put in the book, he wasn't even very sure about at the time. But since then, science seems to have cemented the theory a bit more. But we were talking about things like evolutionary advantages to practicing spear throwing at a target, because then you would be better at hunting, and they would be better at attracting mates, and the same would go for listening to stories around the campfire. So you would know which berries were poisoned and which berries were not. And there were evolutionary advantages to these sorts of things, and they sort of explain the compulsions that we have. And so what I was hoping to mainly get from you today is talking about how true this theory is and how deep that truth goes, as well as what evidence there is for that kind of a theory, and how we can design games around it. But why don't we start with just how true it is? Like, to what extent is it true that fun is learning?
Well, I wouldn't quite go so far as to absolutely equate fun and learning. What my work, the way I talk about it is not so much in terms of fun, but in terms of play. And play, of course, is fun. We do it because it's fun. We don't do it because we're going to learn something from it. We do it just because we want to do it. From an evolutionary perspective, whenever we have a strong drive to do something, we have that strong drive because it has had in our ancestors benefits. That we have a strong drive for all those things that we need that are not necessarily easily available. We humans have a very strong drive to play, especially when we're children, but it doesn't go away when we're adults. All mammals play when they're young. All mammals play as juveniles. Some mammals continue to play into adulthood. And so from an evolutionary perspective, that's interesting. And sort of think about play in children, but also play in adulthood. Children play naturally at all the basic skills that human beings have to learn everywhere. They are particularly motivated to play with other children. And probably the most important things human beings everywhere have to learn is how to get along with one another. And so in play, children are learning how to get along with their peers. They're learning how, if I bully you in play, you're not going to play with me anymore. So I have to learn how to take your needs into account when I'm playing with you. That's one of the many things that children learn in play. By my definition of play, play is an activity that is chosen and directed by the players themselves. That doesn't mean that there can't be rules to it, but you're adopting the rules to it. You are choosing to do this. So among other things, play is how children take initiative. It's how they learn to control their own life, learn to choose to do something, and then learn how to take control of that activity once it's undergoing. And if they're playing socially, they have to negotiate how with their playmates how this is going to go. If you think of the skills that children everywhere need to learn, children play at all of those things. So everywhere, children need to develop their physical bodies, but children everywhere need to learn language. Children learn language in play. They play with the language. They play with this. The initial cooing and babbling is always in a kind of playful state of mind. They're just playing with the sounds. We are the animal that builds our environment. So our children everywhere play at building things. This is called constructive play. We're the only animal, as far as we know, that's capable of imagination, capable of thinking about things that never actually existed or that we have never experienced. This is why we can be hypothetical. We can think hypothetically. It's even why we can think about tomorrow. Tomorrow hasn't happened, but we can hypothesize what might happen tomorrow and think about it. So children engage in imaginative play all the time, where they're, especially little children, where they're practicing hypothetical reasoning. The other thing that anthropologists have observed is that children not only in play practice the skills that children everywhere in the world have to practice, but they also seem to be biologically designed to look around and see what is it that people in my culture do. What seem to be the important skills in my culture, and they play at those things. It's no surprise to me that in our culture today, children looking around, what's the primary tool of our culture? It's unquestionably the computer. So children are drawn to computers in our culture, just like children are drawn to bows and arrows and digging sticks in a hunter-gatherer culture. It shouldn't surprise us. So play is how children learn what they need to know. And in fact, I have done research with children going to radically alternative schools and in homeschooling called unschooling, where they're basically allowed to play and explore and do what they're interested in doing all day long. They're never forced to learn any lessons that somebody else is dictating to them. And yet what my research shows is they become well educated by any meaningful definition of education. They learn the skills, they learn the knowledge that they need. So play is an extraordinarily powerful vehicle of learning. One of the reasons that I think play remains as part of adult life is that, to a much greater extent, I should say, than any other mammal, we need to keep learning throughout our life. We are continuously able to adapt to changes in the world that we're living in, and that's why we were able to live in so many different parts of the world, cold climates, hot climates, and so on and so forth. And it's also why we can adapt to cultural change. And of course, we're seeing cultural change more rapidly than ever now.
It's mammals that mainly play, and then certain mammals play more than others. You were saying in the book that cat-like and dog-like species, or basically carnivore species that rely on hunting, tend to play more because success in hunting is more complex than success in foraging and grazing. And humans, chimps, and bonobos are the primates that play the most. And primates are the mammals that play the most. It's because we have the most to learn.
That is right. And the point you made about those animals, those species that have the most to learn, play the most, is right. And you can pretty much predict what animals will play at by knowing what the major constraints are on their survival. So predatory animals play at predation, and prey animals that are preyed upon by predatory animals play at dodging and darting and getting away from predators. Those are the dominant ways. Monkeys need to be able to be very skilled at swinging around in trees from branch to branch, and they play endlessly at that. When we look at what animals play in adulthood, it tends to be the animals that, as part of their way of life, need to cooperate with one another. So, for example, wolves hunt in packs. And to hunt in packs, they need to trust one another. They need to be able to coordinate their activities with one another. And wolves are one species that, in adulthood, play a great deal. This play is sort of consolidating the relationships among them. It is animals that need to cooperate with one another as part of the way that they live also play with one another in adulthood. We humans have more to learn than any other animal, and no surprise, when we're free to play, when children are free to play, they play more than the young of any other animal. And over a longer period of time, we have a longer juvenile period than other mammals do because we need all that time to practice the skills to become independent of parental care. We need all that time to become fully independent human beings capable of managing our own existence. Of course, we always depend on other people, but to be able to depend on other people on our own terms as adults depends upon a great deal of learning.
How are these ideas seen in evolutionary psychology circles? One thing that we'll kind of never have is those conversations in the psychology space and knowing how different ideas are perceived. So are these kind of accepted as fact now within psychology circles, or is any of it up for debate?
I would say that the things that I've just described are very well accepted by anybody who's ever engaged with them. There are a lot of people in psychology who just sort of don't think about evolutionary approaches to things. And in fact, this idea of play as practice was developed at the end of the 19th century by Karl Groos, and he wrote a wonderful book called The Play of Animals, and then one called The Play of Man, which described basically what I've just described, but it was completely ignored for 100 years, almost completely ignored. The play of animals was not so much ignored. Animal behaviorists always think from an evolutionary perspective, but psychologists were really, in general, late in coming around to thinking in evolutionary terms. And so, it's really only within the last 25 or 30 years that there has kind of been a field called evolutionary psychology that deliberately thinks about. So, just as Groos asked the question, why do animals and children play? Why do they play? I mean, you could argue that it's maladaptive. It could get you into trouble. You're making noise, attracting predators. Sometimes uh, animals and humans play in risky ways. That's another question. Why do they play in risky ways? And sometimes they hurt themselves, and sometimes they even die in play, right? So why didn't evolution weed it out instead of consolidate it? And so it must serve some advantage, he said. And so then he said, well, it's pretty obvious that what the advantage is. Other people hadn't thought of it, but it's pretty obvious once you start thinking about it that the advantage is that this is how animals practice the skills that they need to practice before they're putting those skills into pragmatic use.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I definitely wanted to talk about Karl Groos as well, because you had a really good way of putting it in the book. Play in animals, according to Groos, is essentially an instinct to practice other instincts.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about it in terms of what I said about predatory animals, so predatory animals have an instinct to prey, to chase down or pounce upon other animals and kill them. But to be good at it, they need to practice it. So play at predation is how they practice the instinct of predation. So for us, there are a lot of people there are a lot of psychologists, even today, not so much today, but until relatively recently, a lot of psychologists like to say that human beings don't have any instincts. But on the face of it, that's sort of silly. We don't have instincts that are ingrained the way that instincts are. For the most part, we don't have instincts the way they are in a fish, for example, where it just gets triggered and it goes out and there's no cognitive control over it. It just happens. You catch a fish on an artificial lure and you throw it back and its instinct tells it again to attack that same artificial lure. It doesn't learn that this is not good, whereas a mammal will learn. Wait a minute, mammals are capable of learning from experience. So play is the experience from which they learn. All right, I've got an instinct to attack, to feed on certain kinds of things, but I have to learn how to control this instinct and make sure I'm feeding on the right things. So, and if it requires some skill to get at what I need to get at, then I need to practice that skill. That's the mammalian way. So humans, all those things that I said, humans have an instinct to speak. We have an instinct to speak a language. But we have to practice doing it, and we have to learn how to speak the language of our particular culture, because there's not a universal inborn human language. We've got an instinct to learn language. We've got an instinct to speak with one another, but there's a lot of learning that has to go in order to carry out that instinct. Similarly, we have an instinct to think, to reason, but we have to practice reasoning in order to be good at it. And when children are engaged in hypothetical thinking and their fantasy play, they're practicing reasoning. We have an instinct to build things, but we have to practice doing it. So that's kind of what Groos is saying.
These ideas by Karl Groos, were they largely forgotten about for 80, 85 years and then only picked up in the last 25 years, you said?
They were not forgotten about among some animal behaviorists. They were I would say they were essentially completely forgotten about by psychologists, by people interested in human behavior. And one evidence of that is so in the late 20th century, I I really became acquainted with Groos, and I wanted to get his book, his two books, the Play of Animals and the Play of Man. I could find the Play of Animals easily. The Play of Man was out of print. It has now been republished, so that's kind of an index that, for almost 100 years there, about 100 years, it was forgotten. Publishing company didn't see fit to republish it. Nobody seemed interested in it. The book was actually panned when it first came out. Some people in psychology who really did not understand evolutionary theory wrote negative reviews of it because they said, they had this idea, you have to explain things in terms of causal mechanisms. You can't explain behavior in terms of its effect. Well, of course, the whole Darwinian approach is to explain the evolution of behavior in terms of its effect. These came about because of the effects they have. But that way of thinking was totally foreign and was thought of as unscientific by many early psychologists, including even Piaget, who rejected the book. He was one of the he read the book apparently, or at least was aware of the book in the 1920s, and wrote a negative review of it. This is not science, So,
well, sounds like you're sitting on a collector's item there. That's so interesting to think about. It's almost like they expect you to have a time machine to go back and get evidence. Because, a lot of evolutionary psychology is that, right? Like, it's talking about ideas, but it's impossible to go back 100,000 years and collect evidence. The closest we can get is archaeology and those hunter-gatherer tribes that you mentioned, where, there's still practicing methods that were the closest we can get to what our ancestors used. And so, yeah, they had some really interesting findings, the anthropologists who visited them. One of them being that the tribes that didn't play, there were some tribes that viewed play as almost immoral because they viewed work as a moral activity. So everything had to be focused on work. The children were discouraged from playing.
I think that in all pure hunter-gatherer cultures, children play most of the time, and there's this respect for the child's will. The cultures that you're referring to are not actually hunter-gatherer cultures. These are primitive agricultural cultures. Hunting, in particular, is a highly skilled activity that you need to become good at before you can really contribute to the culture very much. Gathering, kids do help gather, but it's sort of when they're gathering, it's sort of like a picnic with adults and kids doing things together and pick and bear. You can imagine this is sort of all playful and so on and so forth. The other thing about hunter-gatherer cultures is the birth rate is very low in hunter-gatherer cultures. They're a little bit more like our cultures today in that sense. There's not a whole lot of children that you have to take care of. Women's births are spread out typically by at least 4 years, and the unfortunate thing that also keeps the number of children low is there's a lot of stillborns, and without modern medicine and so on, a lot of children die very young or die really at birth. Hunter-gatherers tend to be very lean. The women when you're lean and you are nursing your baby as hunter-gatherer mothers do for 3 years, that inhibits the menstrual cycle, that inhibits ovulation. So babies are spread out by about 4 years by that mechanism. Once you've got agriculture, you've got permanent dwellings, which means that you can accumulate property. If you're hunter-gatherer, pure hunter-gatherer, you're going to be moving around. There's no point in owning more than you can carry on your back. And everything, it depends upon cooperation. You have to share food because especially if you're hunting large animals, not everybody's going to get something to eat every day. So you have to share with the band whatever you bring into camp. Everything is shared in these cultures, and that sharing is reinforced by playing. The hunter-gatherer adults play a great deal with one another as a way of indicating their friendship, their unity, this is how they sort of help keep the band together. So children are playing and learning, but adults are playing as a way of keeping the band together. Now, once you go to agricultural cultures, you get more of individuals owning land, and then they can, among other things, they can have larger families because of the additional calories that come. You've got more food because you're raising it. It's food that tends to be richer in calories, so people have a little bit more body weight on them. And babies are produced at a much faster rate, so families get bigger. And then in order to support the family, you need to put the somewhat older children to work to help do the farming. You also reach a situation where you've got conflict with other people, especially once the land is used up and other people depend upon the people who have land, and you begin to have a stratified society of landowners and those who are not landowners. So it really changes the nature of human society. They can go in different ways, but some of them, the play became a negative thing. You don't want your kids playing because you want them hoeing the field. You want them babysitting the younger children. You want them working on the farm. And so play became something to, in some sense, literally beat out of children.
That's right. You talk in the book about the different values of the different systems where, the hunter-gatherer cultures were much more about sharing and discovery and freedom and letting people do what they want. Whereas farming cultures, once you have farming, you introduce things like property, defending that property. You introduce inheritance, which gives rise to
Right.
capitalism. One of the things I found most striking in the book when we talk about the different values between hunter gatherer cultures and capitalism and farming agriculture cultures is that in the hunter gatherer cultures, they didn't have any games that were competitive. It was all pretty much cooperative. And obviously, because of the reproductive elements that you mentioned, there were age gaps in a lot of the tribes. It was rare that you were playing with multiple children that were the same age as you. So with the age gaps, that introduced more of a nurturing element, or a mentoring element. If you were playing with someone 3 years younger than you, competition kind of didn't make sense anyway. So you were nurturing them. But that was one of the things I found most surprising from the book is that, I would have thought that, I guess I would have perhaps naively thought that competition was inherent to all play, but apparently they just had no competitive games.
That's right. So hunter-gatherer cultures are the only cultures that have been found that have no competitive games. I might have mentioned in the book that one anthropologist told me that when they attempted to teach hunter-gatherer kids to play the game soccer, they refused to play it in any way that there would be a winner or a loser. They developed ways of just playing cooperative. Can we keep this ball up in the air? Can we keep it kicking up? They have all kinds of cooperative games, lots of dance-like games. But to try to beat somebody else, to try to prove yourself better than somebody else. This is essentially a taboo in band hunter-gatherer cultures. This appears to be pretty much true across all the band hunter-gatherer cultures. I can't say for sure that it's totally true for all of them, but certainly the anthropologists that I surveyed, this was pretty clear, and others have written about this too. I don't think children are biologically designed to play competitively. At least if so, it's not a strong drive to play competitively. And part of the reason I say this is I study children. I've done a lot of observations of children in our culture at a school where children are free to do what they want to do pretty much all day. They're free to play and explore. And there's a lot of play and pseudo-competitive play, but nobody seems to care about winning or losing, you know? Um, there are a few exceptions. So, for example, chess, the older player would sacrifice some of his pieces or her pieces in order to make it more fun and more fair. It's when adults get involved in children's play that it becomes competitive. Adults turn play into competition. And so what happens is as soon as you go from just kids playing at baseball in their own way to Little League baseball, suddenly you have winning becoming important. So, but that's now in hunter-gatherer cultures, I don't know how much of it is that just because there's no inducement to compete, that's why there's not competitive games, or how much is it that the culture deliberately, in some sense, discourages competition, and I think that latter. I think both of these things are true. I think that the culture definitely discourages competition. So anything, as I said, it's a taboo in that culture to try to prove yourself better than somebody else. And they will mercilessly tease somebody who acts like a big shot. And so one way to act like a big shot is to win in some kind of a contest with them. So if you're in that society, In our society, people praise you if you win. In that society, you will get criticized. Why did you do that? What, who do you think you are?
Yeah, yeah.
That,
It's interesting to think about the conditioning that goes into it. Like, because there's conditioning on their side to discourage competition, and there's conditioning on our side to encourage competition. And I guess I've
right.
always thought of myself as highly competitive, but I'm wondering now how much of that is conditioning. And, I wanted to send you this graphic and see what you thought of it. This is, I don't know if you've seen this before. This is Bartle's matrix of player types. And it occurred to me while we were talking and while I was reading the book as well, that these player types kind of line up with certain drives that we have. And when you talk about Karl Groos and the different kinds of animal play that he was putting forward towards the beginning of the 20th century, you sort of built on that, and you talked about your universal types of children's play, which was physical play, language play, exploratory play, which isn't necessarily constricted to geography, could be more about just general discoveries. There was constructive play, fantasy play, and social play. So when we look at Bartle's matrix, there's the different player types, and this has been used as a lens in game design for many years at this point. And there's socializer, killer, which is more the competitive side, explorer, and achiever. And there seems to be like some overlap with the different universal play types that you were talking about. But I am looking at a few of these now in a different way, because you talk about the different play types as being functional, which means, you can have kind of all of them in one game if you want. Whereas typically with these player types, we tend to think of them as you have a dominant one and a secondary one. So, I would be a killer explorer because I'm highly competitive and I love figuring out game systems. But now I'm wondering if killer is more of a social construct.
So certainly the idea of socializer interacting with players, that very much resonates with the way I generally think about play. With at least, so one of the clear functions of play is for children is to make friends. It's how children make friends. For a child under 12, almost by definition, a friend is somebody that you play with. And making friends and learning how to make friends, learning how to get along with other people is an extraordinarily important human skill. We cannot survive as individuals. We depend upon connections with other people, and so socializing, learning to socialize, interacting in a way, and having the killer approach would destroy that. Because nobody wants to be your friend if you beat them all the time. Right? you know, so the killer approach is fine if you're in some kind of a tournament, you're never going to see these people again. That's fine. Or if you're kind of evenly matched and you're kind of, and the killer approach is this. Killer is sort of a metaphor here for the fact that you and the other and your opponent, you just love to try to win, and you kind of admire the fact that each of you is trying to win, and you're calling that killing. So that can also be even a way of socializing if you take it as socializing. Interestingly, there's a book by a woman whose last name is Friedman, in which she was interested in why are some parents who have the means to do so spending lots of money and lots of time putting their relatively young children in the age range of 8 to 12 or so in highly competitive activities and urging them on in this competition. And so she did this very interesting study where she identified a fairly large number of families in which this was happening in three categories because we wanted three very different ways of playing. So one was competitive chess, one was competitive dance, and one was competitive soccer. So three very different kinds of activities. And she interviewed the parents about why they're doing this. What do they see as the payback for this investment that they're putting into their children. And she also interviewed not all, but many of the children about how they see it. Interestingly, her main conclusion regarding the parents is the parents to the parents, it was somewhat arbitrary which competitive activity they were in, but it was important that their children were in a competitive activity. The parents believed we live in a very competitive society, and it's very important to learn how to compete, to learn how to develop the skills required to win and the desire to win. So in keeping with that, the parents actually rewarded the children for winning. When they would, beyond the trophies you got from the tournaments, the parents would give the children a real material rewards. It might be financial, it might be a trip to Disneyland. If they increase their ranking in chess, they were trying to reinforce winning, and they really emphasized winning in their talking with the children. So when she interviewed the children, however, they asked the children, "So what do you like about this?" Interestingly, very few of them said, "Oh, I just love to play chess," or "I really like dancing," or "I'm really into soccer." They said two things. One is, I like the rewards my parents give for doing this."
Yeah.
And the other thing they said is, "I like the fact that I make friends on these. I make friends with the people I meet." None of the parents mentioned making friends as a purpose for this. The kids saw that as, aside from the rewards, the main value. And some of them even said to her, I really feel kind of bad when I win sometimes because that means my friend lost." Well, this is a hunter-gatherer attitude in a society that is anything but a hunter-gatherer society, which leads me to think that there is also, to some degree, a kind of genetic component to the human desire. You know, friendship is more important than winning.
It's funny you mentioned, I mean, when I sort of self-analyze and I look at my drive to compete, it's not a desire to dominate. I think it's actually kind of in line with what you're talking about, because whether you're competing with someone or whether you're sacrificing your own pieces just to have a better chess game with someone who is losing, deliberately giving up some of your own pieces so it's a fairer game. In both instances, you're kind of just targeting the best game possible, right? Like,
Right.
if I'm competing against someone who's equal skill level, I'm excited because we'll probably get the best game possible. We'll push each other to do better, and
Right.
more important than actually beating the person is me sitting down at the end of it and saying, "Wow, that was a great chess game." And it's kind of the same when you're giving up some of your own pieces just to have a better chess game, right? It's like in both cases, you're just kind of targeting the best experience possible.
Yeah, I think that's well put, and I agree with what you're saying. So when you're playing a game that in its structure is competitive, um, you here's a point. Let me back up just a moment. Whenever children are playing, children are trying to do the best that they can at whatever it is they're playing. Otherwise, it's boring. No matter if you're building a sandcastle, you want to build the most beautiful sandcastle you can possibly build. Your children, that's how children are learning and playing. They're trying always to do the best they can. Well, if you're playing a competitive game, if you and I are playing chess or a video game that's a competitive video game, the way we measure whether we're doing well is, am I doing better than the other person is? Am I achieving by that standard? On the other hand, just as you said, you wouldn't feel good about winning in a game that was just a kind of a sloppy game. It turned out, it's like there are some great athletes who say, I would rather, I forget if it's Michael Jordan or somebody who said, I would rather lose in a well-played basketball game than win in a poorly played game. So that's a person who's playing for fun, but the fun comes from knowing you're playing well.
I'm reminded of Alex Ferguson from Manchester United after he had, I think the game was like a 5-all, or it was something like 5-all, and then they scored the winning goal in the final minutes to make it something like 6-5. And he was asked after the game, would you rather that or would you rather a 5-0? And he said,
Uh-huh.
honestly, I don't know. I think eventually he said 5-0 just because of the stress of being a manager. But, but he
I
was like, you
see,
know what?
right.
I don't know. Yeah. You mentioned that the children in both hunter-gatherer cultures and also our modern culture, they kind of gravitate towards the skills that the society needs. And there was a direct quote from the book that says, at a gut genetically based level, children recognize that the most crucial skills to learn are those that will be of increasing importance in the future. And this was one part of the book that I wasn't sure if you were talking about increased neuroplasticity, or do you think there's a kind of instinct, even almost like a mystical instinct for knowing what the tribe needs going forward?
When there's change in a culture, when there's new innovations in the culture, older people tend to resist the change. Older people kind of think this is going to be the ruination, video games came around, and older people thought this is going to be the ruination of the next generation, but young people glommed onto it. Similarly with a lot of computer technology. Here's an example with a hunter-gatherer culture that was fairly recent. So it's not in the book that you read. Um, so there was this hunter-gatherer culture that was forced to move out of the forest. The government forced them to move out of the forest to an area located on a river, and and the hunting was not so good in this area, but fishing was good. But the adults had no interest in fishing. They didn't want to fish. The kids were the ones who learned how to fish. And they began to supply the protein that the group needed. They also got really interested in the river. They learned all kinds of river skills, and they got interested in the cultures on the other side of the river, which are the people who live there. So here was a change that was forced upon the society, and the kids thrived with this change, and the adults did not. So I think that there is this I think there's naturally a tendency that parents often want their children to learn and focus on the kinds of skills and knowledge that were important to the parents when the parents were growing up, and and are a little bit distrustful of things that were not part of their growing up. Whereas kids, at some level, whether it's just in their DNA or whether it's cognitively apparent at all to them, at some level know that they're living in a world that is in some ways different from their parents' world. And it's going to continue to move in the direction that they're seeing it's already moving. And so, a perfect example of that in our culture in recent decades is how kids glommed onto the computer and became, when computers became available in the 1990s, when home computers became available, there's actually been a study. Homes with teenagers got computers on average much sooner than other homes did because the kids wanted them. And
Right.
secondly, this is actually documented that in the great majority of those homes, the kids were the computer experts, and they taught their parents how to use them. They were the ones who solved the parents' problem. I know this in part because I am such a part of such a family. It was my son
Yeah.
who really had, for years, he would solve my computer problems until he began to get annoyed with me about it, and then I just had to learn how to do it myself. So, that's a perfect example where there's this change. I think kids saw this is a change. This is at some level, they knew this is my world. This is the world I'm growing up in. And I better get good at that. So just like those hunter-gatherer kids said, this is a different world. We get food now from the river, not from the forest. I better get good at that. So
I can see how that definitely applies to computer skills. Do you think that still applies now that we have on the computer these apps and games and social media that are hyper optimized to just retain attention? Like back in the day, sugar used to be important for us, but now it's very
right,
easy to consume too much sugar. It's almost the
right.
same with like social media. They can be like a trap, you know?
Yeah, I think that that's true, and of course, adults get trapped into it as well as kids get trapped into it, and the media, social media companies make a profit by keeping you involved in what they want to keep you involved in. So that's true, and that's a somewhat different issue from what I was talking about. But it is true. It is something that I think that it's important to learn how to resist. I'm not. There are people who want to talk about this as addiction, as if this algorithm addicts people. I think addiction is too strong a word for it. I think that it's something that people can learn to manage, and it's something that I think over time people will learn to manage it. Just like we learn to manage sugar, that sugar is very attractive, but we learn, too much sugar is not good for us. And so I think people can learn to manage that too. And I think kids are perfectly capable of learning to manage it. That instead of saying we're not going to let kids use social media because they can't manage it, it's going to trap them. I think we have to help children learn to manage it. And I think they're perfectly capable of managing it and probably do a better job of managing it than many adults believe they do.
Yeah. It makes me think of, in Australia, we just introduced a social media ban.
And to me, this is a huge mistake. I mean, we live in the world of social media. At some point, they're going to go into social media. They're not, better that they start it young with adult guidance, with teaching. I do believe in some kind of government controls. It would be nice if pornography were not quite so readily available to everybody. You had to maybe prove an age thing for pornography, but it's depriving children of one of the major ways that in today's world they play and interact with one another.
True, true. Yeah, it's kind of funny to think that it's actually easier to access pornography now in Australia than it is Facebook. But yeah, I've got one more for you, which is, I mentioned before there was a book that came out around 2006 called A Theory of Fun, and the author Raph Koster had been on the podcast before. This is one of the early attempts within the gaming space at explaining a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, the evolutionary psychology element of what fun is. And in the book, Raph kind of made the point that we need to design games not for the compulsions that we used to have, the historical human compulsions that we built up through hundreds of thousands of years, but the compulsions of the future. And, we've got these compulsions that some games are satisfying those compulsions. And I also make a distinction between games that manipulate those compulsions as opposed to satisfying them. But they're all kind of old compulsions that don't really match up with modern life. Like I don't normally need to stalk a cheetah and hit it with an arrow, but, maybe only on Tuesdays. But, if we design games around modern compulsions that don't exist, will anyone feel compelled to play the game? So I'm wondering if there's a conflict there. How do we design games in a way that advances us as a species?
Give me an example of a future compulsion. I'm not sure.
Or I guess they're not even compulsions yet, right? Because like we still have the compulsions of history within us. but they're not quite suitable for modern life. So how do we design games for modern life and for future life, even though we don't have those compulsions yet, but we have to kind of design the games in a way that we still want to play them, right? We feel compelled to play them.
So these games do represent skills that are important to the culture today and increasingly important in the future, um, because partly they're computer skills, partly they're fast action skills, partly we live in a fast-paced society. There was studies done. This was some time ago, but there were studies done about that looked at what are the video games that are most attractive. The result basically was that the games that people get involved with are in fact games that satisfy the three basic important psychological needs that are needs always need basic human needs. One of them is the need for autonomy, so the need for some freedom. If the game is too restrictive in how you can play it, but if the more range or the more range of creativity in playing the game, the more attractive the game was. A second basic need we all need is a sense of competence. So we want to feel free to choose what we're doing, but we also want to feel that we're good at things that we value. So games that made it very clear, that had sort of levels of competence, and it was very clear you're getting better at this, and that the levels were appropriately structured so that you could achieve the next level, not too easily. It took effort to get there. So you feel proud that you made it to the next level and then the next level. And then the third thing is connections to other people. And so once you had multiplayer games and you had people playing in some sense cooperatively as well as competitively, then the games began to meet that. And so the games that there are people from psychologists who were looking at to what degree the games meet these basic psychological needs. And how does that map on to how popular the games are? And at first, the games that had a lot of people upset, a lot of adults upset, was so many of the games had violent content in them. But what the researchers showed is, though the games that had violent content also happened to be, from other perspectives, the most interesting games. And once you develop games that were equally interesting, that didn't have violent content, they became popular games, and they had the additional benefit that girls were more likely to play them than they were who were more likely to be put off by the violence in the more violent games. So, I'm almost 82 years old, so I've got a brain that was built long ago in a different time. And my brain does not operate as fast, and not because I'm 82 years old. It never operated as fast as is required for a lot of things that happen today. I was in a slower paced world growing up. And so, when the news is hitting me fast, 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 I can't follow it. I'm still on the first thing. There's people who've sort of tracked the plots of television programs over time. So I'm in the I Love Lucy era of television, right? It was slow moving. You could easily follow it. There were not a lot of different simultaneous plots going on. There are not a whole lot of characters coming in and out of it. Now you look at what are the popular television programs, and to be honest, I have great difficulty following them because it's too fast paced. There's too many things happening at once.
Hmm.
So one of the things that is being developed, and there's actually research showing this in playing sort of fast paced video games, where you have to pay attention to a lot of things at the same time. You're developing basic mental competencies, which have to do with keeping a lot of things in short-term memory, being able to shift your attention rapidly from one thing to another, being able to make quick but accurate decisions. These were things not so important in the world that I grew up in, but seem to be more important in this more fast-paced world today. So that's one way of thinking about how how the structure of video games to maybe kind of mapping on a structure of what's required. We now live in a world where we are, because we're connected to the whole world, and we are kind of bombarded with information about the whole world. We have so many tracks of things going on, and we have to make decisions about what track we want to pay attention to in this world where we're bombarded with information. And so I think that there is something to be said about the fact that it's not so surprising that young people are playing these fast-paced games that at some level they may recognize this is developing, whether it's innate that they're recognizing this is developing the kind of ability that fits with a kind of ability that's actually pretty important for life in today's world.
There's often like the game outside the game where it's about figuring out how to get more grunts out of the game, get more frames per second, and often that involves some computer skills and things like that. But you're kind of saying there's also like a kind of cognitive muscle that you can work out almost.
Yeah, I mean, this has been shown. There are review articles on the showing that if you look at sort of the skills that are measured by IQ, by IQ tests, which tend to be how many items can you hold in short-term memory, making quick decisions, those kinds of things. There is research showing that playing video games develops all of those things, and in fact, it's been argued that no technique for improving IQ scores has been discovered beyond fast action video games.
Oh
Fast
wow, really?
action video games develop those skills. It has been
Oh
shown
wow.
over and over, and there are even brain imaging studies showing that those parts of the brain involved in those skills grow in people who play fast action video games. So these are positive benefits of video games if you think of these abilities as positive abilities. Some people would argue, no, it's better if we're just all slow down rather than speed
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
But but this has been shown over and over again. There are really dozens of studies and many meta-analyses and review articles showing that these brain effects are real.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter, for making the time and for joining us. I'm so glad that we could get you on and talk about your work and your ideas. I think there's enormous value there. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.